In the opulent foyer of 1247 Hillcrest Manor, a modest widow in a simple navy dress was about to confront 15 years of hidden truth. What started as a dinner invitation took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her son's casual cruelty. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical struggling mother. For 15 years, she had spent her life secretly managing a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, known for her invisible generosity and unwavering sacrifice. When she encountered David's dismissive demand to figure it out during a thunderstorm, she had no idea she was walking into a revelation that would shatter everything. Margaret's decision to walk home in the rain that night would lead to consequences that would destroy her son's carefully constructed world. What began as a family dinner would become a reckoning of epic proportions. The wealthy community would never be the same after they discovered that the embarrassing mother they'd dismissed actually owned everything their golden boy claimed to have earned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen smoothed her simple navy dress as she stood before the wrought iron gates of 1247 Hillcrest Manor. The mansion beyond gleamed like a jewel against the twilight sky, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled across manicured lawns she had never walked upon. 15 years. 15 years since she'd first signed the deed transfer papers that made this property hers, and tonight would be the first time she crossed its threshold as anything more than a distant observer. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the intercom button. The irony wasn't lost on her, asking permission to enter her own home. Yes? The voice belonged to Maria, the housekeeper David employed with money that ultimately traced back to Margaret's accounts, though he would never know it. Margaret Chen, I'm here for dinner. The gates swung open with mechanical precision, and Margaret walked up the cobblestone driveway she'd approved in architectural plans but never experienced firsthand. Each step felt surreal. The Italian marble steps leading to the front door had cost more than most people's cars. The hand-carved oak doors, imported from England, bore brass hardware that could have funded a scholarship. All of it hers. All of it paid for with inheritance she'd kept hidden for reasons that seemed increasingly questionable with each passing year. David opened the door before she could knock, his expression a careful mask of tolerance rather than welcome. At 38, he'd inherited his father's sharp features, but none of his warmth. Tonight he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, his hair styled in a way that screamed expensive salon. "Mother," he said, the word carrying the weight of duty rather than affection. "You're on time." "I always am," Margaret replied, stepping into the foyer. The breath left her lungs in a quiet rush. The space soared 3 stories above them, crowned by a crystal chandelier that had required a specialized crane to install. Persian rugs worth more than some houses covered floors of imported marble. Oil paintings lined the walls, investments she'd approved sight unseen, now displayed in the home where she'd raised David before her husband's death, forced them into more modest circumstances. Or so David believed. "The Worthingtons are already here," David continued, his voice carrying a warning she recognized from his childhood. "Behave yourself. Along with the Sterlings and Mr. Blackmont from the country club. This is an important evening for my career." Career. Margaret bit back the urge to remind him that his career success was built on a foundation of properties and investments he'd never earned. Instead, she followed him through rooms she'd never seen but had paid to furnish, her modest heels clicking against floors worth more than most people would see in their lifetimes. The living room buzzed with conversation and the gentle clink of crystal. Margaret recognized the type immediately, the professionally successful who'd confused wealth with worth, image with substance. David's wife, Patricia, held court near the fireplace. Her auburn hair swept into an elaborate updo that showcased diamond earrings Margaret's money had likely purchased. "Everyone," David announced, his voice carrying across the room. I'd like you to meet my mother. She helps with Emma when we need her. Not his mother who'd sacrificed everything for his education. Not the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to keep him in private school after his father's death. His mother who helped with Emma, like hired help. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest as she nodded politely to the assembled guests. The Worthingtons looked through her with the practiced indifference of people who'd learned to categorize others within seconds. Mrs. Sterling offered a weak smile before turning back to her wine. Mr. Blackmont from the country club, the club, David belonged to because Margaret owned the building that housed his investment firm, barely acknowledged her presence. How lovely, Patricia said, gliding over with the predatory grace of a socialite who'd mastered the art of subtle cruelty. David mentioned you'd be joining us. That's quite the dress. Very practical. The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Margaret's navy dress, purchased at a department store 3 years ago, suddenly felt shabby against Patricia's designer gown. But Margaret had worn designer gowns once, too, before she'd made the choice to live modestly. Before, she'd decided to test her family's character rather than enable their greed. "Where's Emma?" Margaret asked, changing the subject before Patricia could deliver another perfectly aimed barb. "Upstairs," David replied without looking at her. "She'll be down for dinner. Patricia thought you could keep her entertained while we discuss business." "Of course." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd been invited not as family, but as free child care. The realization shouldn't have surprised her, but it did. Somehow she'd held on to the hope that this rare invitation meant David wanted her here as his mother, not as a convenience. "Margaret," a voice called from across the room. She turned to find Emma bounding down the staircase, her 16-year-old face bright with genuine pleasure. "You came!" The girl threw her arms around Margaret with the enthusiasm David had lost somewhere between childhood and his current incarnation as a man who treated his mother like staff. Emma had inherited her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's kind heart, qualities that seemed to have skipped David entirely. "Of course I came," Margaret said, holding her granddaughter close. "You asked me to." It had been Emma who'd sent the invitation, not David. Emma who'd texted her grandmother secretly, begging her to attend this celebration of her father's latest business acquisition. Another acquisition built on Margaret's invisible foundation, though Emma didn't know that. No one knew except Marcus Webb, her property manager, and James, her younger son, who'd chosen teaching over chasing wealth. As dinner was announced, Margaret found herself seated at the far end of the massive dining table she'd never chosen, but had certainly paid for. The mahogany surface could seat 20. Tonight, it held 8, with Margaret positioned as far from the center of conversation as geography would allow. She watched David hold court from the head of the table, regaling his guests with tales of his business acumen. "The Riverside Development Project," he was saying, cutting into his prime rib with theatrical flair, "required vision. The property had been sitting vacant for years. Everyone said it was too risky, but I saw the potential." Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She remembered the Riverside property. Marcus had brought her the deal 2 years ago, a struggling shopping center in a changing neighborhood. The purchase and renovation had cost Margaret nearly $3 million, money David knew nothing about. Yet here he sat, claiming credit for her vision and her financial risk. "It wasn't entirely vacant," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the dinner conversation. "There was a small community center there that provided services to immigrant families." The table fell silent. David's face darkened in a way that reminded Margaret of his father during his worst moods. But where her husband's anger had been quick and regretful, David's carried a cold calculation that chilled her. "Mother," he said, the word sharp as a blade. "I don't think our guests need to hear about every little detail." "I think it's relevant," Margaret continued, her voice still soft but carrying new steel. Those families lost their gathering place when the property was developed. Business requires difficult decisions, Patricia interjected, her tone suggesting Margaret was too simple to understand such complexities. David created 47 jobs with that development. Surely that outweighs a few inconvenienced families? Margaret looked around the table at faces that reflected Patricia's sentiment. To them, 47 jobs justified displacing a community. To them, profit margin mattered more than the elderly Vietnamese man who'd lost his free ESL classes, or the single mothers who'd lost affordable after-school care. Emma was watching her grandmother with interest, her young face reflecting questions that wouldn't form into words for several years yet. But Margaret could see the girl processing the conversation, filing away the differences between her parents' values and what her grandmother had just revealed. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of business talk and social posturing. Margaret remained largely silent, observing the world her money had built from the perspective of an unwelcome outsider. She watched David flourish in conversations about country club politics and investment strategies, never once acknowledging that his success rested on advantages he'd never earned. She watched Patricia orchestrate social connections with the precision of a conductor, treating relationships like stepping stones to higher status. And she watched Emma grow quieter as the evening progressed, the girl's natural empathy creating distance between herself and her parents' world. As the evening wound down and guests began their elaborate farewells, Margaret felt the weight of 15 years pressing against her chest. 15 years of sacrificing her own comfort to test her son's character. 15 years of hoping he would grow into the man his father had been. 15 years of enabling behavior that had created the stranger now laughing too loudly at Mr. Blackmont's mediocre jokes. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. The storm Margaret had heard predicted on the radio was arriving ahead of schedule, promising the kind of downpour that would make driving treacherous and walking impossible. She watched David say goodbye to his guests with the practiced charm of someone who understood that relationships were transactional. When the last car pulled away, Margaret approached him quietly. "David," she said, "could you give me a ride home? The storm's getting worse." He turned to her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not just irritation, but something approaching disgust. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said, his voice low but carrying the kind of fury that made Emma look up from her phone. That comment about the community center, in front of the Blackmonts? Margaret felt the words hit her like physical blows. You were just reminding everyone that my mother doesn't understand business," David interrupted. "Do you have any idea how hard I work to maintain my reputation? And you want to undermine it with your bleeding heart comments about some immigrant center?" The contempt in his voice was naked now, undisguised by the social niceties he'd maintained. During dinner. This was what he really thought of her. This was who her son had become. "I just need a ride home," Margaret said quietly. "The storm—" "Figure it out," David said, already turning away. "You managed to get here, didn't you? I'm sure you can manage to get home." The dismissal was final, absolute, as if she were a servant who'd overstepped her bounds and was being shown the door. Margaret stood in the foyer of her own home, surrounded by luxury she'd provided but could never enjoy, and realized that 15 years of testing her son's character had revealed more than she'd ever wanted to know. Outside, the storm broke with the fury of something that had been held back too long. The first drops of rain splattered against the tall windows as Margaret stood in the marble foyer, her simple purse clutched in hands that trembled more from shock than cold. David's words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. "Figure it out. You managed to get here, didn't you?" "David, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's pouring out there." He turned back to her with an expression that would have been more appropriate for a stranger who'd broken into his home. His face was flushed with anger, his carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from the evening's social performance. Behind him, Patricia watched from the doorway to the living room, her arms crossed and her expression suggesting she was enjoying the show. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" David's voice rose, echoing off the 3-story ceiling. "You come into my home, embarrass me in front of important clients, and then expect me to play the dutiful son, to drop everything and chauffeur. You around like you're some kind of... like I'm your mother?" Margaret finished quietly. The words seemed to ignite something volatile in David. His face contorted with a rage that transformed his features into something almost unrecognizable. "My mother? My mother wouldn't sabotage my career for the sake of some bleeding heart political statement. My mother would understand that success requires sacrifice." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the storm that was rapidly intensifying. Thunder followed immediately, so close it rattled the expensive crystal in the chandelier above them. Margaret flinched involuntarily. "The weather's getting dangerous," she tried again, hating how small her voice sounded in the vast space. "I just need—" "What you need," David interrupted, advancing on her with deliberate steps, "is to learn some respect. You think because you're my mother you can waltz in here and undermine everything I've worked for? Well, let me tell you something. My success isn't dependent on your approval or your presence." Patricia chose that moment to glide closer, her designer heels clicking against the marble with calculated precision. "David's right, Margaret. You really did put him in an uncomfortable position tonight. The Blackmonts are very influential in our social circle." Margaret turned to her daughter-in-law, searching for any hint of compassion in those carefully made-up features. "I didn't mean to cause problems. I was just pointing out—" "That's exactly the problem," Patricia cut her off. "You don't understand our world. The decisions David makes aren't simple matters of right and wrong. They're complex business strategies that require a certain sophistication to appreciate." The condescension in Patricia's tone was like salt in an open wound. Margaret had been managing complex real estate portfolios when Patricia was still in high school, but she couldn't say that. The weight of her secret knowledge pressed against her chest like a physical force. "I understand more than you think," Margaret said quietly. David laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that bore no resemblance to the boy who'd once giggled at her bedtime stories. "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you understand very little about what it takes to succeed in this world. You live in that tiny apartment, shopping at discount stores, completely disconnected from reality." Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, and Margaret could hear the rain intensifying against the windows. What had started as scattered drops was becoming a deluge. "Please," she said one more time, her pride finally cracking. "Just let me call a taxi. I'll wait in the kitchen until—" "No." David's voice was final. "You made your choice when you decided to embarrass me tonight. You want to act like you know better than me? Fine. Figure out your own transportation." He moved to the front door and pulled it open with theatrical force. Wind and rain immediately swept into the foyer, soaking the Persian rug and causing papers on a nearby table to scatter. The sound was deafening, a roar of water and wind that seemed to fill the entire house. "David, you can't be serious," Margaret said, backing away from the open door. "It's dangerous out there." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to humiliate me in front of my guests." He gestured toward the door with mock courtesy. "Your chariot awaits, Mother." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. This was her son, the boy she'd worked 2 jobs to support through college, the young man she'd encouraged through his first heartbreak, his career struggles, his marriage, the son for whom she'd sacrificed her own comfort and happiness for 15 years, living modestly while secretly ensuring his success. "Emma's upstairs," Margaret said desperately. "What will she think if—" "Emma will learn that actions have consequences," David replied coldly. Just like you're about to. Margaret looked past him to Patricia, searching for any intervention, any basic human decency. Instead, she found only satisfaction in the woman's eyes, as if Margaret's humiliation was exactly what she'd been hoping for. The wind howled through the open door, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and the promise of a long, miserable night. Margaret clutched her purse tighter and walked toward the door, each step feeling like a betrayal of everything she'd believed about her relationship with her son. As she reached the threshold, David spoke one final time. "And don't expect any help from the staff. I'll make sure they know you're not welcome here anymore." Margaret stepped out into the storm. Immediately, the rain soaked through her thin dress, plastering her gray hair to her scalp and chilling her to the bone. She turned back once, hoping against hope that David would come to his senses, but he was already closing the door. The sound of the lock engaging was audible even over the storm. Margaret stood on the covered porch for a moment, processing what had just happened. The wind whipped around her, carrying rain even under the protective overhang. In the distance, she could see the warm glow of windows throughout the neighborhood, her neighborhood, though no one knew it. Each light represented a home, a family, people who were safe and dry while she stood abandoned in the storm. She pulled her phone from her purse with shaking hands, trying to shield it from the rain. The screen was already fogging with moisture. She tried calling a taxi company, but the storm was interfering with the signal. After several failed attempts, she admitted defeat and slipped the phone back into her purse. The walk home would take 45 minutes in good weather. In this storm, on roads that were already flooding, it could take over an hour. Margaret pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders, a futile gesture against the driving rain, and stepped off the porch into the full fury of the storm. The first few blocks were the worst. Her shoes, designed for indoor dinner parties rather than hiking through floods, filled with water immediately. Her dress clung to her body like a second skin, and the wind kept changing direction, ensuring that no part of her remained dry. But as she walked, something began to change inside her. The anger started as a small flame in her chest. With each step, each gust of wind that threatened to knock her down, each car that passed without stopping to help an obviously distressed elderly woman, the flame grew larger. She passed the Riverside Shopping Center, her shopping center, where David's office was located. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see the empty spaces that had once housed the community center she'd mentioned at dinner. The families who'd gathered there, the children who'd done homework in its after-school programs, the elderly immigrants who'd learned English in its classes, all displaced for the sake of higher-end retail spaces that generated more rent. Margaret had approved that development. She'd listened to Marcus Webb's financial projections and agreed that it made business sense. But she'd never seen it through David's eyes until tonight, as nothing more than profit margins and status symbols. By the time she reached the halfway point of her journey, Margaret was no longer walking. She was marching. Her small frame moved through the storm with a determination that surprised her. The rain continued to pour down, but she was no longer cowering from it. Instead, she tilted her face toward the sky and let it wash over her. 15 years. 15 years of enabling. 15 years of making excuses. 15 years of telling herself that David's behavior was just a phase, that success and maturity would eventually teach him humility and gratitude. Her phone buzzed in her purse. Even through the protective leather, she could feel the vibration. When she finally found a bus stop shelter to duck under, she pulled it out to find a series of frantic text messages from Emma. "Grandma, are you okay? Dad said you left, but it's storming really bad. I can't believe he made you walk home. I'm so sorry. Please text me when you get home safe. I love you." Margaret stared at the messages through rain-blurred vision, though she couldn't tell if the moisture on the screen was from the storm or from tears. Emma understood. At 16, her granddaughter possessed the basic human decency that had somehow skipped her father entirely. Margaret typed back with numb fingers, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me. I love you too." But she wasn't fine. Not anymore. The woman who had left David's mansion was gone, washed away by the storm. The woman who emerged from that bus, shelter and continued walking through the flooded streets was someone new. Someone who was done being taken advantage of, done being invisible, done enabling the very behavior that had led to this moment. As she turned onto her own street, Margaret could see a light on in the house next door. Eleanor Blackwood, her 72-year-old neighbor, was known for keeping late hours. The retired judge had sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, and Margaret had always appreciated her no-nonsense approach to life. What Margaret didn't expect was to find Eleanor standing at her front window, clearly watching for her return. The moment Margaret appeared on the sidewalk, Eleanor's front door flew open. "Margaret Chen!" Eleanor's voice carried over the storm with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding courtrooms. "What in God's name are you doing walking home in this weather?" Margaret looked up at her neighbor, really looked at her, and, for the first time all evening, felt like someone was seeing her as a human being rather than an inconvenience. "I had dinner at David's," Margaret called back, having to shout over the wind. "He wouldn't give me a ride home." Eleanor's expression shifted from concern to fury in the span of a heartbeat. "He what?" And in that moment, Margaret realized she was no longer alone in her anger. The storm was ending, but the reckoning was just beginning. Eleanor Blackwood's kitchen felt like a sanctuary after the storm. Margaret sat wrapped in a thick terry cloth robe that dwarfed her small frame, her wet clothes tumbling in the dryer down the hall. Steam rose from the mug of tea Eleanor had pressed into her hands, chamomile with honey, the kind of comfort Margaret hadn't experienced in years. 15 minutes, Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from Margaret with her own mug. 15 minutes I watched you walk up that street like a drowned cat, and I'm supposed to believe your son simply couldn't give you a ride? Margaret wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, grateful for the heat that was finally beginning to penetrate her chilled bones. Eleanor's kitchen was everything Margaret's own wasn't. Spacious, well-appointed, filled with the kind of quality appliances and fixtures that spoke of old money rather than new wealth. It was the kitchen of someone who'd never had to choose between comfort and principle. "He was angry with me," Margaret said quietly. "I said something at dinner that he felt undermined his business reputation." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. "His business reputation? Margaret, the boy throws you out in a thunderstorm because you hurt his feelings and you're making excuses for him?" The directness of it hit Margaret like a slap. She'd been making excuses for David for so long that it had become automatic, a reflex born of 15 years of justifying behavior that had grown progressively worse. "You don't understand," Margaret began, then stopped herself. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Don't I?" Eleanor leaned forward, her gray eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made her one of the state's most respected judges, before her retirement. "Margaret, I've been your neighbor for 8 years. I've watched that boy treat you like hired help every time he deigns to visit. I've seen him drop Emma off here like you're a free babysitting service. And tonight, I watched him force his 62-year-old mother to walk 4 miles in a hurricane." Margaret flinched at the stark assessment. Hearing it laid out so plainly, without the softening filter of maternal love, made David's behavior sound even worse than it had felt in the moment. "There's something I haven't told you," Margaret said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. "About David. About why I've put up with it for so long." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting with the patience of someone who'd spent decades listening to confessions and testimonies. Margaret took a shaking breath. "The mansion where David lives? I own it." The silence that followed was absolute except for the distant rumble of the dryer and the rain still pattering against the windows. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a sharpening of focus that reminded Margaret she was speaking to a woman who'd built her career on reading between lines. "I own it," Margaret continued, the words gaining strength as she spoke them. "And the shopping center where his office is located, and 17 other properties throughout the valley. When my husband died 15 years ago, he left me everything, a real estate empire I never even knew he was building." Eleanor set down her tea mug with deliberate care. "And David has no idea." "None. I've been living modestly, letting him think I'm just getting by on Social Security and a small pension. I wanted—" Margaret paused, struggling to articulate, motivations that seemed increasingly foolish in retrospect. "I wanted to see who he really was, what kind of man he'd become without the temptation of inherited wealth. And what you discovered," Eleanor said slowly, "is that you've been subsidizing the lifestyle of a man who's become exactly the kind of person wealth without character creates." The words hit Margaret with the force of revelation. That was exactly what she'd done. By hiding her wealth while secretly enabling David's lifestyle, she'd created the worst possible outcome. A son who believed he'd earned everything while learning none of the lessons that actual earning would have taught him. "Every month," Margaret continued, her voice gaining a bitter edge, "I approve the expenses for that house, the mortgage payments, the maintenance, the staff salaries, through my property manager, Marcus Webb. David thinks he's renting from some faceless corporation, but every dollar he pays in rent goes right back into his own household expenses." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her sharp mind clearly working through the implications. "Margaret," she said finally, "do you realize what you've created?" "A monster," Margaret whispered. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "You've created leverage." The word hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities. Margaret looked up at her neighbor, really looked at her, and saw something she'd never noticed before. Behind Eleanor's grandmotherly exterior was the mind of someone who'd spent 40 years manipulating legal systems to achieve justice. "What do you mean?" Eleanor rose from her chair and began pacing the kitchen with the restless energy of someone plotting strategy. "Think about it, Margaret. Your son just humiliated you, abandoned you in a storm, treated you with less respect than he'd show a stray dog. And all the while, he's living in your house, using your money, building his reputation on a foundation you've provided. But revealing that now would destroy him," Margaret protested. "His marriage, his career, his standing in the community. Would it?" Eleanor stopped pacing and fixed Margaret with a stare that must have terrified countless defendants. Or would it force him to confront the truth about himself? To finally learn the lessons you've been trying to teach him for 15 years? Margaret's phone buzzed against the table where she'd set it to dry. A text from James. "Mom, Emma called me crying. She said Dad made you walk home in the storm. Are you okay? I'm coming over." "That's James," Margaret said, showing Eleanor the message. "My younger son." "The teacher?" Eleanor asked. "The one who actually visits you regularly and treats you with respect?" "Yes. He knows about the inheritance. He's never asked for anything, never treated me differently because of it." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Then he understands the difference between earned respect and purchased compliance." Before Margaret could respond, she heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, she could see James jogging through the rain toward Eleanor's front door, his teacher's salary evident in his modest car and practical jacket. Eleanor was already moving toward the door. "Perfect timing. We're going to need an ally." Minutes later, James sat in Eleanor's kitchen, his brown hair damp from the rain and his face tight with concern. At 45, he possessed a quiet strength that reminded Margaret of her late husband, the same thoughtful eyes, the same tendency to listen more than he spoke. "Mom," he said simply, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," Margaret replied, but even as she said it, she realized that wasn't entirely true. Something fundamental had shifted tonight. The woman who'd left David's mansion in the storm wasn't the same one sitting in Eleanor's kitchen. "James," Eleanor interjected, "your mother has just told me something very interesting about your brother's living situation." James's eyes moved between the two women, and Margaret saw understanding dawn in his expression. "You told her?" "Finally," Eleanor said with satisfaction, "and now we're going to discuss what to do about it." Margaret looked at the two people. Flanking her, James with his steady loyalty and Eleanor with her sharp legal mind, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just support, but the sense that she wasn't facing this alone. "I need to call Marcus," Margaret said suddenly. "My property manager. I need to understand exactly how much David's lifestyle depends on my money." Eleanor smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Now you're thinking like someone who's spent too many years being underestimated." As Margaret scrolled through her contacts to find Marcus's number, James spoke quietly. "Mom, whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. But are you sure you're ready for this? Once you start down this path?" "There's no going back," Margaret finished for him. "I know." But as she dialed Marcus's number, Margaret realized she didn't want to go back. The woman who'd spent 15 years hiding her strength, sacrificing her dignity, enabling her son's worst impulses, that woman had been left behind in the storm. The phone rang twice before Marcus's familiar voice answered. "Mrs. Chen? It's rather late. Is everything all right?" "Marcus," Margaret said, her voice steady for the first time all evening, "I need you to pull together a complete financial analysis of the Hillcrest Manor property. Everything, monthly expenses, maintenance, costs, the full scope of what we've been covering for David." There was a pause on the other end. "May I ask why?" Margaret looked around Eleanor's kitchen, at James's concerned face, and Eleanor's encouraging nod, and felt the last of her doubt wash away. "Because," she said, "it's time my son learned the truth about his success." As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that the storm outside was finally breaking, but the reckoning she'd set in motion was just beginning. Margaret arrived at Marcus Webb's office building the next morning with a clarity of purpose that surprised her. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming in the early sunlight. But the emotional tempest inside her had only intensified overnight. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through 15 years of memories, each one now viewed through the lens of what Eleanor had helped her understand. The Chen Properties Management Office occupied the top floor of a modest downtown building, another property in Margaret's portfolio that she'd never visited as anything more than a name on financial reports. Marcus had chosen the location specifically for its discretion. Wealthy clients preferred their property managers to operate away from the flashier commercial districts where they might be recognized. Marcus Webb stood as she entered his office, his tall frame unfolding from behind a desk covered with neat stacks of documents. At 52, he possessed the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's secrets. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed, his suit impeccable but not flashy, the uniform of a man who understood that his job was to remain invisible while handling very visible wealth. "Mrs. Chen?" he said, his voice carrying the warm formality that had made her trust him from their first meeting 12 years ago. "I have to say, your call last night concerned me. It's not like you to request such comprehensive financial reviews." Margaret settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting absently that the office furniture was nicer than anything in her own modest apartment. Marcus had always maintained that clients expected a certain level of sophistication from their property managers, and she'd never questioned the expense. Now she wondered how many other details of her business operations she'd left to others, while she focused on playing the role of struggling widow. "I need to understand exactly how much my son's lifestyle depends on my money," Margaret said without preamble. Not just the obvious expenses. Everything. Marcus's expression shifted. Subtly, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something she'd never seen before. Protectiveness. It lasted only a moment before his professional mask returned, but it was enough to make her wonder what else she'd been blind to over the years. "I've prepared the analysis you requested," Marcus said, pulling a thick folder from his desk drawer. "I must warn you, Mrs. Chen, the scope is extensive." He opened the folder and spread documents across the desk with practiced precision. Financial statements, property deeds, expense reports, lease agreements, a paper trail that mapped out David's life in stark numerical terms. "The Hillcrest Manor property is just the beginning," Marcus said, his finger tracing down the first page. "Monthly operating costs, $12,000. That includes mortgage payments, utilities, maintenance, staff salaries, landscaping, and insurance. Your son believes he pays $4,500 monthly in rent, but that money is immediately transferred back to cover household expenses he knows nothing about." Margaret stared at the numbers, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. $12,000 a month? "The mansion requires significant upkeep," Marcus explained gently. "But that's not all. The Riverside Shopping Center where your son leases his office space, the monthly rent he pays is $3,200. The actual cost of that premium corner office in today's market would be $8,500. We've been subsidizing the difference." He turned to another page, and Margaret felt her breath catch. His country club membership, his private parking space downtown, the lease on his BMW, all connected to properties or businesses in your portfolio. We've structured it so that he receives employee discounts or preferred customer rates that effectively mean he's paying roughly 30% of the actual cost for everything. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. Column after column of figures told the story of a man living far beyond his means while believing himself entirely self-sufficient. "How much?" she whispered. "In total, how much am I subsidizing his lifestyle?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, consulting a calculator. "Annually, approximately $180,000 in direct subsidies. That doesn't include the opportunity costs. The income you're not receiving because you've chosen to support his lifestyle rather than maximize your investment returns." The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. Nearly $200,000 a year. More than most families earned in their entire annual income. She was quietly funneling to a son who treated her like an embarrassment. "There's more," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but relentless. "The investment firm where your son works, Hartwell and Associates. They manage portfolios for several businesses that are ultimately subsidiaries of your holdings. Your son has been claiming credit for securing those accounts, but they were directed to his firm through our business relationships." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. "You mean his professional success is largely built on connections he doesn't know exist? I've been very careful to maintain the appearance that these are independent business relationships, but the reality is that your son's reputation as a successful investment advisor rests significantly on accounts that trace back to your wealth." Margaret pushed back from the desk, needing space to process what she was hearing. Through the office windows, she could see the city skyline, buildings and businesses, many of which bore her name on ownership documents she'd signed but never really examined. For 15 years, she'd been operating a complex financial empire, from the shadows, never realizing that she'd created an elaborate fiction that had consumed her son's entire identity. "Mrs. Chen," Marcus said carefully, "may I ask what prompted this investigation?" Margaret looked at the man who'd been managing her affairs for over a decade, really seeing him for the first time. The protective way he'd arranged the documents, the gentle tone he used when delivering devastating information, the fact that he'd never once questioned her unusual arrangement with David, never suggested that she was enabling destructive behavior. "He threw me out in the storm last night," she said simply. Made me walk home in the rain because I embarrassed him in front of his friends. Marcus's professional composure cracked. He what? Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. Emma. Grandma, can I come see you this afternoon? I need to talk to someone. Margaret showed Marcus the message. My granddaughter. David's daughter. She's the only one in that family who treats me like a human being. She's welcome here, Marcus said immediately. Mrs. Chen, I have to tell you, I've been concerned about this arrangement for years. Watching your son benefit from your generosity while treating you with such disrespect, it's been difficult to remain professionally neutral. Margaret stared at him. You've wanted to tell me to stop enabling him. It's not my place to advise you on family matters, Marcus said carefully. But as someone who's watched you sacrifice your own comfort to support a man who seems incapable of gratitude, yes, I've wanted to say something. An hour later, Emma knocked softly on the office door. Margaret had texted her the address, telling her only that she was handling some business matters. The 16-year-old looked smaller than usual in her school uniform, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost fearful. Grandma, Emma said, rushing to hug her. I was so worried about you last night. I couldn't sleep thinking about you walking home in that storm. Margaret held her granddaughter close, inhaling the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. I'm fine, sweetheart. But what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school? Emma pulled back, her young face serious in a way that reminded Margaret of her late husband. I told them I had a dentist appointment. Grandma, I need to tell you something about Mom and Dad, about what they said after you left last night. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus discreetly moved to the far corner of his office, ostensibly reviewing documents but clearly giving them privacy. Emma glanced at him uncertainly. Mr. Webb manages some business affairs for me, Margaret explained. He's trustworthy. Emma nodded and sat in the chair beside Margaret's. After you left, Mom and Dad were celebrating. They were happy that you'd embarrassed yourself, happy that they had an excuse to keep you away from their friends. Mom said it was the perfect opportunity to establish boundaries with you. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of boundaries? They're planning to move, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad got some kind of big promotion, and they want to relocate to the Morrison family compound in Connecticut. Mom thinks it would be the perfect way to get away from your influence on me. The words hit Margaret harder than she'd expected. They weren't just planning to limit her access. They were planning to disappear entirely, taking Emma with them. There's more, Emma continued, tears starting to form in her eyes. I heard them talking about how relieved they'd be to not have to include you in family events anymore. Mom said you were a liability to their social standing, and Dad agreed, he said. He said he was tired of pretending to care about someone who didn't understand their world. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling each word like a separate wound. But underneath the pain was something else, a growing anger that felt clean and righteous and powerful. Emma, she said gently, how would you feel if they couldn't move? If circumstances forced them to stay here? Emma looked up with hope and confusion warring in her expression. What do you mean? Before Margaret could answer, Marcus's intercom buzzed. His secretary's voice filled the office. Mr. Webb, there's a Mr. Robert Morrison Sr. here to see you. He says it's about the Riverside Shopping Center lease negotiations. Margaret and Emma exchanged glances. Emma's eyes widened. That's my grandfather, Mom's dad. Marcus looked to Margaret for guidance. She thought quickly, her mind racing, through the implications. Robert Morrison Sr. was here about business that connected to David, another piece of the puzzle she'd never seen clearly. "Send him in," Margaret said. Robert Morrison Sr. entered the office with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 68, he carried himself like someone who'd built his fortune through personal force rather than inheritance. His eyes swept the room, taking in Margaret with obvious interest. "Mr. Webb," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I'm here about the lease rates for the Riverside property. My research suggests that the current tenant, my son-in-law David Chen Morrison, is paying significantly below market rate. I'm wondering if the property owner might be interested in discussing more realistic terms." Margaret felt Marcus, tense beside her. Robert Morrison Sr. Sharp eyes moved between them, clearly noting their reaction. "Grandfather," Emma said quietly. Robert turned to his granddaughter with genuine warmth. "Emma, darling, what are you doing here?" Emma looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly. "Grandma had some business to take care of. She's helping me with some things." Robert's attention focused on Margaret with new intensity. "Mrs. Chen, isn't it? David's mother? How interesting to find you here, in the office of the property manager for Riverside Shopping Center." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Margaret could see the wheels turning in Robert's mind, a successful businessman putting together pieces of a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. Margaret made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Morrison," she said, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Chen, and I'm the owner of the Riverside Shopping Center, among other things." Robert Morrison Sr.'s eyebrows rose, slightly, but his expression remained controlled. "How very interesting," he said slowly. "I think we need to have a conversation." As Margaret shook his hand, she realized that her decision to investigate David's finances had opened a door she could never close. The truth was going to come out now, one way or another. The only question was whether she'd control how it happened. The silence in Marcus's office stretched for several heartbeats as Robert Morrison Sr. processed Margaret's revelation. Emma sat frozen between them, her young face reflecting the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Marcus remained at his desk, his professional composure intact, but his eyes alert to the shifting dynamics. Robert released Margaret's hand slowly, his sharp gaze studying her with new respect. "The mysterious property owner who's been subsidizing my son-in-law's lifestyle," he said finally. "I have to admit, Mrs. Chen, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Margaret asked, settling back into her chair with a composure that surprised her. Something about Robert's directness cut through the emotional fog she'd been navigating since last night. "Someone weak," Robert replied bluntly. "Someone being taken advantage of without realizing it. But you know exactly what's been happening, don't you? Which makes this situation far more interesting than I initially thought." Emma looked between them, confusion evident on her young face. "Grandfather, what are you talking about? What investigation?" Robert's expression softened as he looked at his granddaughter. "Emma, sweetheart, I've been concerned about your father's financial situation for some time. His lifestyle doesn't match his income. Hasn't for years. I've been trying to understand how he affords everything." Margaret felt a flicker of kinship with this man she'd barely met. "And now you know." "Now I know that David's entire adult life has been built on a foundation he doesn't even realize exists," Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of disappointment, which explains a great deal about his character, or lack thereof. Marcus cleared his throat softly. "Perhaps we should move this conversation to somewhere more private. I have a conference room down the hall." 20 minutes later, they were seated around a polished table with Marcus's detailed financial reports spread before them. Robert studied the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades building his own business empire, while Emma sat quietly, absorbing information that was reshaping her understanding of her family. "This is extraordinary," Robert said, looking up from a particularly dense spreadsheet. "Mrs. Chen, you've essentially created an alternate reality for your son. Every major expense in his life is subsidized. Every business success is built on connections he doesn't know exist, and he's convinced himself he's entirely self-made." "I wanted to test his character," Margaret said quietly. "I thought if he believed he had to earn everything himself, he might develop the values his father tried to teach him. Instead, you've created a man who takes credit for success he hasn't earned while treating the source of that success with contempt," Robert replied. His words weren't cruel, but they were brutally honest. "You've given him all the benefits of wealth without any of the responsibility that should come with it." Emma spoke up suddenly, her voice small but clear. "That's why he's so angry all the time. Why nothing ever seems to be enough for him or Mom. They're always worried about money, but they never seem to actually not have any." Margaret looked at her granddaughter with surprise. "You've noticed that?" "I'm not blind, Grandma. Dad talks about making sacrifices and working hard, but we live in a mansion and take expensive vacations. It never made sense to me." Emma paused, then added with startling maturity, "And now I know why he gets so defensive when anyone questions his success. Deep down, he must know something isn't right." Robert nodded approvingly at his granddaughter's insight. "Emma's right. David's behavior suggests he's fighting a subconscious awareness that his success doesn't quite add up. The guilt manifests as aggression and the need to constantly prove himself." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. How many times had she watched David overreact to perceived slights, lash out when his competence was questioned, or desperately seek validation from people whose approval shouldn't have mattered to a truly confident man? "So, what do we do about it?" Emma asked. The question hung in the air, loaded with possibilities. Margaret found herself looking at Robert Morrison Sr. with new interest. This was a man who understood both wealth and responsibility, who'd built his fortune honestly and raised a daughter who, despite her flaws, at least knew where her advantages came from. "We give him a choice," Robert said finally, "but not just any choice. We give him a choice that reveals his true character without any room for self-deception." Margaret leaned forward. "What kind of choice?" Robert's smile was sharp and calculating. "We present him with the truth, but we do it in a way that gives him the opportunity to either rise to the occasion or reveal exactly who he really is. No excuses, no room for blame, no way to avoid taking responsibility for his own character." Marcus, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "What did you have in mind, Mr. Morrison?" "A business proposition," Robert said, his eyes gleaming, with the kind of strategic thinking that had built his empire. "David believes he's a successful investment advisor, correct? So we give him the opportunity to prove it. We present him with a significant investment opportunity, a chance to manage a portfolio for a wealthy, anonymous client." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "You mean?" "I mean, we set up a scenario where David believes he's being given the chance of a lifetime. A mysterious investor wants to hire him to manage a substantial portfolio. He'll be so focused on impressing this potential client that his true nature will show through." Emma's eyes lit up with understanding. "And the mysterious investor would be your grandmother," Robert finished. "Disguised, of course. Presented as a successful businesswoman considering various investment options. David won't recognize her. People see what they expect to see, and he expects his mother to be powerless and poor." Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and dread. "And then?" "Then we see what he does," Robert said simply. "Does he try to impress this investor by denigrating his own family? Does he show integrity in his business practices? Does he demonstrate the kind of character that deserves the advantages he's been given? Or does he reveal himself to be exactly the kind of person we're afraid he's become?" The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. Consequences. Margaret could see the appeal. It would give David every opportunity to redeem himself while providing undeniable proof of his character, one way or the other. But what if he passes the test? Margaret asked. What if he shows integrity and respect? Then we tell him the truth and give him the chance to make amends, Robert replied. We explain what's been happening and see if he's capable of growth and gratitude. And if he fails? Robert's expression grew serious. Then you'll have the proof you need that continued enabling isn't love, it's cruelty. To him and to yourself. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from James. Mom, can we talk tonight? I'm worried about you after what happened. She showed the message to Robert and Emma. My other son. He's been my anchor through all of this. He should be part of this conversation, Robert said immediately. If we're going to do this, we need to make sure everyone who cares about you is on board. That evening, Margaret's modest apartment felt crowded with the weight of the decision before them. James sat on her small couch next to Emma, while Robert occupied the single armchair she normally reserved for reading. Eleanor had arrived an hour earlier, armed with legal documents and a sharp analysis of Margaret's rights as a property owner. Let me see if I understand this correctly, James said, his teacher's mind working through the implications. You want to test David's character by having him unknowingly pitch his services to our mother, who will be disguised as a potential client. That's the essence of it, Robert confirmed. The goal is to create a situation where David's true nature will be revealed without any external pressure or manipulation. Just him, being himself, when he thinks he's talking to someone who might advance his career. Eleanor looked up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. From a legal standpoint, there's nothing problematic about this approach. Margaret has every right to investigate potential investment advisors, even if one of them happens to be her son. And there's certainly nothing illegal about a property owner deciding to reevaluate their tenant arrangements. But is it right? Emma asked quietly. I mean, morally? The question cut to the heart of Margaret's internal struggle. She looked around the room at these people who'd rallied to support her, each offering their own expertise and perspective. But ultimately, the decision was hers. Emma, Margaret said gently, what would you do if someone you loved was hurting themselves and others with their behavior, and nothing you'd tried for 15 years had worked? Emma was quiet for a long moment. I guess I'd want to know if they were capable of changing, if there was still hope. That's all we're trying to determine, Robert said. Whether David is capable of being the man you all hoped he could become, or whether he's too far gone to salvage. James leaned forward, his expression troubled. Mom, I support whatever you decide, but I need you to be prepared for the possibility that David fails this test. Are you ready to face the consequences of that? Are you ready to potentially lose him entirely? Margaret felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on her. 15 years of hope, of sacrifice, of believing that somehow, some way, her love and patience would transform her eldest son into the man his father had been. 15 years of watching him grow more entitled, more cruel, more distant from everything she'd tried to teach him. I've already lost him, she said quietly. The boy I raised, the son I thought I knew, he's been gone for years. What I've been holding on to is a ghost, a memory of who he used to be. Maybe it's time to find out who he actually is. Eleanor reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. Then we do this properly. We give him every possible chance to succeed, and we document everything carefully. If he fails, there can be no doubt about what we witnessed. Marcus, who had remained quietly thoughtful throughout the evening, finally spoke. Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support it completely. But I also want you to consider what comes after. If David fails this test, if the truth comes out, you'll need to be prepared to follow through. Half measures won't work anymore. Margaret nodded slowly. What would following through look like? Complete transparency, Marcus replied. No more subsidies, no more secret support. David would need to face the reality of his actual financial situation and his actual capabilities. The mansion, the office space, the lifestyle, all of it would need to be renegotiated based on what he can actually afford. He'd lose everything, Emma said, her voice small. He'd lose everything he never earned, Robert corrected gently. What he's capable of building honestly would remain. Margaret looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd become her allies in this strange, painful journey toward truth. Eleanor, with her sharp legal mind and fierce protectiveness. James, with his steady loyalty and moral clarity. Emma, with her youth and honesty and hope for something better. Robert, with his understanding of both wealth and responsibility. Marcus, with his quiet competence and years of discretion. All right, she said finally. We do this, but we do it right. David gets every possible chance to show his best self. And if he can't? She paused, feeling the weight of the words she was about to speak. If he can't, then at least we'll know who we're really dealing with. Robert nodded with satisfaction. I'll set up the meeting. We'll make it look completely legitimate. A referral from one of my business contacts, a potential client looking for investment services. David will have no reason to suspect anything unusual. How long do we have to prepare? Margaret asked. I can have everything arranged within a week, Robert replied. That gives us time to prepare you for the role, set up the backstory, make sure every detail is perfect. As the evening wound down and their unlikely alliance solidified into a concrete plan, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of control over her own destiny. For 15 years, she'd been reactive, responding to David's behavior with patience and sacrifice and hope. Now, finally, she was taking action. The test they were designing would be David's final chance to prove he was worthy of the advantages he'd been given. It would also be Margaret's final chance to discover whether the love she'd clung to for so long was based on reality or delusion. As her allies prepared to leave, each offering final words of support and encouragement, Margaret stood at her apartment window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, David was sleeping in a bed paid for with her money, in a house, owned by her trust, believing himself to be a self-made man who deserved every advantage he'd been given. In 1 week, that comfortable illusion would be put to the ultimate test. The question that would keep Margaret awake tonight wasn't whether David would pass or fail. The question was whether she was strong enough to accept whatever truth the test revealed. Margaret stood before the full-length mirror in the boutique hotel suite, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The transformation had taken 3 hours and a team of professionals that Robert Morrison Sr. had discreetly arranged. Her usually simple gray hair had been colored to a rich chestnut brown and styled in an elegant updo that added years of sophistication to her appearance. Professional makeup had erased the lines of worry and sacrifice that had defined her face for so long, replacing them with the confident glow of someone accustomed to success. The charcoal gray business suit was perfectly tailored, its expensive fabric draping her small frame in a way that suggested authority and wealth. Diamond earrings, borrowed from Eleanor's collection, caught the light as she turned her head. Even her posture had changed under the guidance of the image consultant Robert had hired. Gone was the apologetic stoop of someone trying not to take up space. In its place stood a woman who expected respect and received it. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, she said to her reflection, testing the name they'd chosen for her alias. Widow of tech entrepreneur Charles Ashford, looking to diversify her late husband's portfolio. The backstory was elaborate but believable, constructed with the same attention to detail that Marcus brought to managing her actual properties. Victoria Ashford was wealthy, but not flashy, intelligent but not arrogant, someone who'd inherited substantial assets and was wise enough to seek professional management rather than attempt to handle everything herself. A soft knock at the door interrupted her rehearsal. "Mrs. Chen?" Marcus's voice carried through the thick wood. "It's time." Margaret took one last look at herself in the mirror. The woman reflected there looked nothing like the modest widow who'd been thrown out into the storm 3 days ago. This woman belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, making decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of lives. "Mrs. Ashford," she corrected herself quietly, then opened the door. The law offices of Hartwell and Associates occupied 2 floors of one of downtown's most prestigious buildings, another property in Margaret's portfolio, though she'd never set foot inside before today. The lobby gleamed with marble and brass, designed to impress clients with its obvious expense. Margaret walked through it with the confident stride of someone who belonged in such spaces, though her heart hammered against her ribs with each step. Robert Morrison Sr. waited for her near the elevators, looking every inch the successful businessman in his navy suit and gold watch. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her transformation, and he nodded with approval. "Victoria," he said, warmly, playing his role as the mutual friend who'd arranged this introduction. "You look magnificent. David Chen Morrison is very lucky to have this opportunity." The elevator ride to the 14th floor passed in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Margaret used the time to center herself, to push down the maternal emotions that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. Today, she wasn't David's mother. She was Victoria Ashford, and Victoria Ashford had no reason to care about David Chen Morrison beyond his potential value as an investment advisor. The offices of Hartwell and Associates reflected the same expensive tastes as the building's lobby. Margaret noted absently that the monthly rent for this space was nearly double what David actually paid, thanks to her invisible subsidies. The receptionist, a young woman who probably earned more than most teachers, guided them to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. David was already there, standing with his back to the door as he gazed out at the skyline. He'd dressed for the occasion in what Margaret recognized as his most expensive suit, his hair styled to perfection, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed himself destined for greatness. When he turned to greet them, his smile was practiced and charming. "Mr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand to Robert with just the right amount of deference. "Thank you so much for thinking of me for this opportunity." Then his eyes moved to Margaret, and she held her breath. Would he recognize something familiar in her face? Would some deep subconscious part of him know he was looking at his mother? But David's expression showed nothing but professional interest as he took in her expensive appearance and obvious wealth. In his eyes, she saw only calculation, assessment of her potential value to his career. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice warm with practiced charm as he extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you. Robert has told me wonderful things about your late husband's business acumen." Margaret shook her son's hand, noting the firm grip he used when he thought he was dealing with someone important. "Mr. Chen Morrison," she replied, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone educated in expensive boarding schools. "I'm always interested in meeting investment professionals who come highly recommended." They settled around the polished conference table, with David at the head in the power position he'd automatically assumed. Margaret sat across from him, studying his face as he launched into his prepared presentation. This was her son, her firstborn, the child she'd rocked to sleep and taught to ride a bicycle and worried over through every childhood illness. But the man speaking to her now might as well have been a stranger. "The current market presents unique opportunities for discerning investors," David began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own expertise. "Traditional portfolio management focuses too heavily on conservative approaches that fail to maximize growth potential." Margaret listened to him speak, noting the way he claimed credit for investment strategies that Marcus had helped develop through their business relationships. Every success story David shared traced back to connections Margaret had provided without his knowledge, but he presented them as evidence of his own brilliance. "Tell me about your personal philosophy, Mr. Chen Morrison," Margaret interjected during a pause in his presentation. "How do you balance the pursuit of profit with ethical considerations?" David's smile faltered slightly, as if the question had caught him off guard. "Ethics are important, of course," he said carefully. "But in the investment world, our primary obligation is to our clients' financial interests. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions." "Difficult how?" Margaret pressed, her voice remaining neutral despite the chill that was settling in her chest. "Well," David leaned back in his chair, warming to a topic he clearly felt passionate about. "Take the Riverside Shopping Center development, for example. One of my most successful recommendations. The property was underperforming because it was housing a community center that served low-income families. Immigrant families, mostly." Margaret felt her breath catch. This was her property, her decision, but David was presenting it as his achievement. "The previous management was too sentimental," David continued, his voice gaining confidence. "They were charging below-market rates for the community space, essentially subsidizing services that weren't economically viable. I recognize that the property's true value lay in attracting higher-end retail tenants." "And the families who use the community center?" Margaret asked quietly. David waved his hand dismissively. "Business isn't a charity, Mrs. Ashford. Those families had other options: public libraries, schools, community centers in less desirable neighborhoods. My job is to maximize returns for my clients, not to solve social problems." The casual cruelty in his voice was devastating. Margaret watched her son describe the displacement of vulnerable families as if it were a brilliant strategic decision, not a human tragedy. These were the people she'd tried to help, the reason she'd initially opposed Marcus's development plans, but David saw them only as obstacles to profit. "You mentioned family earlier," Margaret said, steering the conversation in a different direction. "Do you have children yourself?" David's expression brightened. "A daughter, Emma, 16 years old. She's at an excellent private school, Westfield Academy, very exclusive." "And your mother?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Is she still living?" The change in David's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of barely controlled irritation. "Yes, unfortunately. She lives nearby." "Unfortunately?" Margaret repeated, though every word felt like swallowing glass. David glanced at Robert, as if seeking permission to speak freely among fellow members of the wealthy elite. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm sure you understand the challenges of managing family relationships when there are significant differences in social positioning." "I'm not sure I follow." David leaned forward, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "My mother is a lovely woman, but she comes from a very different world. Simple values, modest means. She doesn't understand the complexities of modern business or the importance of maintaining professional relationships. Sometimes she can be embarrassing." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. Her son, the child she'd sacrificed everything for, was describing her as an embarrassment to a stranger, seeking sympathy for the burden of having a mother who didn't meet his social standards. "How is she embarrassing?" Margaret asked, surprised by how steady her voice remained. "Well, for instance, just last week she attended a dinner party at my home. Important clients were there, the kind of people who could make or break a career. And she felt it necessary to question my business decisions in front of everyone, bringing up irrelevant details about some immigrant families. She has these bleeding heart tendencies that she simply doesn't understand are inappropriate in professional settings." David's voice was gaining momentum now, as if he'd found someone who would finally understand his frustrations. "The truth is, Mrs. Ashford, success requires difficult choices. Sometimes you have to distance yourself from people who can't appreciate the complexities of wealth and achievement. Even family. Even your mother, Margaret said quietly. Especially mothers, David replied with a laugh that held no warmth. They never really accept that their children have outgrown their simple worldview. My mother still thinks I should be grateful for her sacrifices when I was growing up, as if working 2 jobs to pay for my education was some kind of extraordinary gift rather than basic parental obligation. Margaret felt the room spinning. Slightly. David wasn't just dismissive of her current role in his life. He was rewriting their entire history, transforming her sacrifices into obligations and her love into burden. She worked 2 jobs to support your education? Margaret asked. After my father died, yes. But that's what parents are supposed to do, sacrifice for their children's future. It's not something that requires eternal gratitude, and certainly not something that gives her the right to interfere in my professional life now. Robert Morrison, Senior, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. That's a very interesting perspective on family obligation, David. David turned to him with relief, apparently interpreting Robert's comment as support. I knew you'd understand, Robert. Successful people recognize that family relationships are just like any other relationship. They have to provide mutual value. When someone becomes a liability rather than an asset. He shrugged eloquently. Margaret sat in stunned silence, watching her son reduce 15 years of maternal love to a cost-benefit analysis. The boy who'd once cried when she worked, late shifts, who'd promised to take care of her when she got old, who'd told her she was the best mother in the world, that boy was truly gone. In his place sat a stranger who viewed her as an embarrassing burden to be managed and, when possible, discarded. Mrs. Ashford, David said, turning back to her with renewed confidence. I hope my honesty about family matters doesn't concern you. I believe in transparency with potential clients. You need to know that I understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries and professional standards. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and realized that the test was over. She'd learned everything she needed. To know about David's character, his values, and his capacity for gratitude or love. The verdict was devastating, but undeniable. Mr. Chen Morrison, she said, rising from her chair with the dignity that 15 years of sacrifice had earned her. Thank you for your time today. This has been illuminating. I'll need a few days to consider your proposal. David stood as well, his confidence intact. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm confident that once you review my track, record and recommendations, you'll see that I'm exactly the kind of investment advisor you're looking for. As Margaret shook her son's hand one final time, she felt the last of her illusions crumble away. The man standing before her was capable of many things, but love, gratitude, and basic human decency weren't among them. Goodbye, David, she said softly. He didn't recognize the finality in her voice or the way she spoke his name. To him, she was just another potential client walking away, already forgotten as he began planning how to spend the commission he assumed he'd earn. Margaret walked out of the conference room with her head high and her heart broken, finally understanding what 15 years of enabling had truly cost. Not just her own dignity, but her son's soul. The evening of David's monthly dinner party arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the mansion's extensive gardens look like something from a magazine cover. Margaret sat in the back seat of Marcus's luxury sedan, watching the house. She owned grow larger through the windshield. Tonight, however, she wasn't arriving as the embarrassing mother seeking a ride home. Tonight, she was coming as the owner. The transformation from 3 days ago remained largely intact, though she'd opted for a more dramatic look this evening. The midnight blue dress was elegant without being ostentatious, perfectly tailored to her small frame, but unmistakably expensive. Her hair had been restyled into a sophisticated chignon, that added years of authority to her appearance. Diamond jewelry, her own this time, pieces she'd kept hidden in a safety deposit box for over a decade, caught the light from the mansion's exterior illumination. "Are you ready for this, Mrs. Chen?" Marcus asked quietly from the driver's seat. In the passenger seat, Eleanor Blackwood turned to study Margaret with sharp, concerned eyes. "I've been ready for 15 years, Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I just didn't know it until now." Behind them, a second car carried James and Robert Morrison Sr., along with Margaret's attorney, Patricia Winters, a woman whose reputation for discretion and effectiveness had made her the preferred legal counsel for the city's wealthiest families. The documents in Patricia's briefcase would leave no room for doubt about Margaret's ownership of the property or her legal rights as landlord. Through the mansion's tall windows, Margaret could see the familiar scene playing out. David stood near the fireplace, gesticulating animatedly as he held court before a small group of his professional associates. Patricia Morrison Chen moved through the gathering with practiced grace, playing the perfect hostess in a home that wasn't hers. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so devastating. The guest list tonight includes the Worthingtons, the Sterlings, and several partners from Hartwell and Associates, Marcus reported, consulting his notes. All people who know David professionally but not personally. Perfect witnesses. Margaret nodded, steeling herself for what was about to happen. She'd spent the last 3 days grappling with the aftermath of David's test, replaying his casual, cruelty and dismissive assessment of her sacrifices. The boy she'd raised was truly gone, but the man who'd replaced him needed to understand the consequences of 15 years of taking her for granted. "Emma texted me an hour ago," James said, from the car behind them, his voice reaching Margaret through the open window. "She's upstairs doing homework but aware something important is happening tonight. She asked me to tell you she loves you, no matter what." Margaret felt her heart clench. Emma was the one innocent in all of this, the one person whose relationship with her grandmother hadn't been tainted by greed or entitlement. Whatever happened tonight, Margaret was determined to preserve that bond. "Shall we proceed?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying the anticipation of someone who'd waited years to see justice served. Margaret took a deep breath, gathered her purse, and stepped out of the car. The cool evening air felt sharp against her skin, but underneath her elegant dress, she felt the warmth of righteous anger that had been building for 3 days. She wasn't nervous anymore. She was ready. Marcus rang the doorbell, an absurd courtesy given that Margaret owned the house, but one that maintained the facade for a few more moments. Through the ornate glass panels flanking the door, Margaret could see David approaching, his expression shifting to confusion as he registered the unexpected arrival of what appeared to be a delegation of very well-dressed individuals. David opened the door with the practiced smile he reserved for potentially important guests, but his expression faltered as he took in the group before him. Marcus he recognized from their monthly rent transactions, though he'd never questioned why his landlord's property manager personally collected payments. The others were strangers, except "Mrs. Ashford?" David's voice carried a note of bewilderment as he focused on Margaret. "What are you doing here? And how do you know where I live?" Margaret smiled, and there was something in the expression that made David take an involuntary step backward. "Good evening, David. May we come in? I believe we have some business to discuss." David's social training kicked in, overriding his confusion. "Of course, please, come in. Though I have to say, this is rather unexpected. I thought we were scheduled to meet at my office tomorrow to discuss your investment decision." "The meeting has been moved," Margaret said simply, stepping into the foyer with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "And the venue has changed as well." The others followed her inside, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Margaret could hear the dinner party conversation continuing in the living room, unaware that their host's carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "David, Patricia Morrison Chen appeared in the hallway, her hostess' smile faltering as she took in the unexpected guests. "What's going on? Who are these people?" "Mrs. Morrison Chen," Margaret said before David could respond. "How lovely to see you again. Though I don't believe we were properly introduced the last time I was here." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she studied Margaret's face, clearly struggling to place her. The elegant woman before her bore little resemblance to the modest, rain-soaked figure she'd dismissed just days ago. "I'm sorry," Patricia said carefully. "Have we met?" "We have," Margaret replied. "Though you might not recognize me without my simple navy dress and the rain-soaked appearance. I'm Margaret Chen, David's mother." The words hit the foyer like a physical force. Patricia's mouth opened in shock, while David's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror. In the living room, conversation began to fade as guests became aware of some disturbance at the front of the house. "Mother?" David's voice cracked slightly. How did you? What's going on?" Margaret gestured toward Marcus. "I believe you know Mr. Webb, my property manager. And this is my attorney, Patricia Winters. Mr. Morrison and Mrs. Blackwood you've met, though perhaps not in their current capacity as my advisors." David's eyes darted between the assembled group, his mind clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. "Property manager? Mother, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that this house belongs to me, David. That it has belonged to me for 15 years. That every payment you've made in rent has gone directly back into maintaining your lifestyle. That your entire adult life has been subsidized by the woman you threw out into a storm 3 days ago." The words hung in the air like an explosion waiting to detonate. Patricia Morrison Chen went white, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against her pale skin. David opened and closed his mouth several times without making a sound. From the living room, voices grew louder as guests began moving toward the foyer, drawn by the obvious tension. Margaret could see the Worthingtons and the Sterlings approaching, along with several partners from David's firm, perfect witnesses to the revelation that would destroy his carefully cultivated image. "That's impossible," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You live in that tiny apartment. You shop at discount stores. You work part-time at the library." "I choose to live modestly," Margaret corrected. "I chose to test your character rather than spoil you with unearned wealth. I chose to see what kind of man you'd become if you believed you had to earn everything yourself." Marcus stepped forward, opening the briefcase he'd carried from the car. "Property deeds, mortgage documents, 15 years of expense reports," he announced to the growing crowd. "Mrs. Chen owns this house outright, along with 17 other properties in the valley, including the Riverside Shopping Center where your son's office is located." David's guests had gathered in a semicircle around the drama unfolding in the foyer. Margaret could see the shock and fascination on their faces as they processed what they were hearing. These were people who prided themselves on understanding wealth and power, yet they'd completely misjudged the modest woman they'd dismissed just days ago. "The monthly expenses for this property alone are $12,000, Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "Mr. Chen Morrison pays $4,500 in rent, which is immediately transferred back to cover household costs he's unaware of. His BMW, his country club membership, his office space, all subsidized through Mrs. Chen's portfolio." Patricia Morrison Chen found her voice first. "You're lying," she said, though the tremor in her voice suggested she was beginning to understand the truth. "David is successful. He's built everything we have through his own hard work." Margaret turned to her daughter-in-law, with something approaching pity. "Patricia, your husband hasn't earned a single substantial success in his adult life without my invisible support. The investment clients he's so proud of securing, they were directed to his firm through business relationships I maintain. The lifestyle you've both grown accustomed to? It exists because I've chosen to enable it." David seemed to find his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Why? Why would you do this to me?" "I did this for you," Margaret replied, her voice carrying 15 years of accumulated pain. "I did it because I hoped that believing you had to earn everything would teach you humility, gratitude, and respect for the value of hard work. Instead, it taught you to take credit for successes you didn't earn, while treating the source of those successes with contempt." She turned to address the gathering crowd, her voice growing stronger. "3 days ago, during a thunderstorm, my son forced me to walk home rather than provide a simple ride. He told me I was an embarrassment to his professional reputation. He complained to a potential client about having to tolerate a mother who doesn't understand his sophisticated world." David's face was now completely white, the implications of his mother's words sinking in. His colleagues and friends stood watching in fascination and horror as his carefully constructed image crumbled before their eyes. "The potential client he was complaining to," Margaret continued, "was me. Disguised as Victoria Ashford, I listened to my son describe his own mother as a burden to be managed and, when possible, discarded." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret could hear the grandfather clock in the living room ticking, counting off seconds that felt like hours. David's mouth moved without sound, his eyes wide with the realization of how thoroughly he'd exposed himself. Mrs. Chen, one of David's colleagues, Michael Worthington, spoke up hesitantly. "You're saying that David's success, his lifestyle, everything we've seen, it's all been built on a foundation he knew nothing about," Margaret confirmed, "subsidized by a woman he's learned to treat as an embarrassment rather than the source of everything he claims to have achieved." Emma's voice suddenly rang out from the top of the staircase. "Grandma?" Everyone turned to see the 16-year-old, standing at the railing, still in her school clothes but with an expression of dawning understanding on her young face. She'd clearly been listening from upstairs, absorbing every word of the revelation. "Emma, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "come down here." Emma descended the stairs slowly, her eyes moving between her grandmother's elegant appearance and her parents' stricken faces. When she reached the bottom, she walked directly to Margaret's side. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," Emma said clearly, her young voice carrying through the silent foyer. "I'm proud that you finally told them the truth." Patricia Morrison Chen seemed to snap out of her shock. "Emma, you don't understand what's happening here. Your grandmother is... This is some kind of mistake, some kind of... It's not a mistake, Mom," Emma said firmly. "And it's not a surprise. I've always known Grandma was special. I just didn't know how special." Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time since entering the house. Her granddaughter's loyalty and understanding in this moment of family destruction was a gift she hadn't expected. David finally found his voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. "Mother, I didn't know. If I had known." Margaret looked at her eldest son, really looked at him, and saw not the confident businessman who'd dismissed her days ago, but a frightened man finally confronting the truth about himself. "If you had known, David, what would you have done? Differently? Would you have treated me with respect because I was wealthy, when you couldn't manage to treat me with respect because I was your mother?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because they all knew the truth. David would have been obsequious and grateful if he'd known about her wealth, but that would have been motivated by greed rather than love. "I'm offering you one last chance," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You can acknowledge what you've done, show genuine remorse, and work to become the man your father hoped you'd be. Or you can continue to believe that you're entitled to advantages you never earned while treating the people who love you as burdens to be managed." David looked around the foyer at the faces surrounding him. His shocked colleagues, his panicked wife, his disappointed daughter, and his mother, who stood before him like a force of nature finally unleashed. "Choose wisely," Margaret said quietly, "because this is the last choice I'll give you." The silence stretched on, heavy with 15 years of accumulated disappointment and the weight of a decision that would determine whether this family could ever heal or if this moment marked its final, irreversible fracture. The silence in the foyer stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of 15 years of deception finally exposed. David stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to process. Shock, denial, rage, and something that might have been the first stirrings of comprehension. Around him, his dinner guests remained transfixed by the domestic drama unfolding before their eyes. Their expensive wine forgotten as they witnessed the complete destruction of a man's carefully constructed identity. Margaret watched her son struggle with the revelation, seeing in his face the exact moment when denial finally gave way to acceptance. His shoulders sagged slightly, and she recognized the gesture from his childhood, the way he'd looked when caught in a lie that had grown too big to maintain. "David!" Patricia Morrison Chen's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She'd recovered from her initial shock and was now studying the situation with the calculating mind that had made her such an effective social climber. "We need to talk. Privately." She grabbed her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Excuse us," she said to the assembled group, her hostess training allowing her to maintain some semblance of social grace. Even as her world crumbled, "We need a moment." But Emma stepped forward before her parents could retreat. "No," the 16-year-old said firmly, her young voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room. "Whatever you're going to say, you can say it here. Grandma deserves to hear how you really feel about her." Patricia's mask slipped slightly, revealing the panic underneath. "Emma, you don't understand the complexities of—" "I understand that you've been living in my grandmother's house while treating her like garbage," Emma interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I understand that Dad built his entire career on advantages he didn't know he had, then had the nerve to call Grandma an embarrassment." David seemed to find his voice at his daughter's words. "Emma, that's enough. You're 16 years old. You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Emma shot back, turning to face her father with blazing eyes. "I understand that Grandma has been sacrificing for this family for 15 years while you two have been taking credit for her generosity. I understand that she's shown you more love and patience than you deserve, and you repaid her by throwing her out in a storm." Margaret felt a surge of pride in her granddaughter, mixed with sadness that a child should have to defend the basic principles of love and respect that adults had forgotten. Patricia's composure finally cracked. "You want to talk about understanding?" She snapped at Emma, her voice rising. "Do you understand what this means for our family, our social standing? Our future?" She turned to Margaret, her eyes blazing with anger and desperation. "You've destroyed us. Do you realize that? David's reputation, his career, our position in the community, all of it is ruined because you decided to play these games instead of just telling us the truth." Margaret met her daughter-in-law's gaze steadily. "I destroyed nothing, Patricia. I simply stopped enabling behavior that was already destroying David's character. The reputation you're so worried about was built on a lie. The position you valued so highly was purchased with money you didn't earn. What I've done is reveal the truth." "The truth?" Patricia laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you've been manipulating all of us for 15 years. You let us believe we were succeeding on our own merits while secretly controlling everything behind the scenes. How is that any different from what you're accusing David of?" The question hung in the air, and Margaret felt its weight. Patricia wasn't entirely wrong. Margaret's deception had been just as elaborate as the fiction it had created in David's mind. Before Margaret could respond, the front door opened, and James stepped inside, followed by Robert Morrison Sr. James took in the scene quickly, his mother standing regally in the center of the foyer, David pale and shaken, Patricia furious, and Emma standing protectively beside her grandmother. "I see the truth is finally out," James said quietly, moving to stand beside Margaret. His presence provided immediate comfort, a reminder that not all of her children had forgotten how to love without condition. David looked at his younger brother with something approaching desperation. "James, did you know? Did you know about all of this?" "I've known about Mom's inheritance for years," James replied calmly. "I've also known that she was using it to support you while you convinced yourself you were self-made. I've been waiting for her to stop enabling your behavior and start demanding the respect she deserves." "You knew, and you said nothing?" David's voice cracked. "You let me humiliate myself. Let me believe—" "I let you make your own choices," James corrected firmly. "Just like Mom did. She gave you every opportunity to show gratitude, humility, and love. You chose arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty instead." Robert Morrison Sr. stepped forward, his authoritative presence commanding attention from everyone in the room. "David," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and disappointment, "I'm going to tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age." David turned to his father-in-law, perhaps hoping for support or understanding from another successful businessman. "Wealth is a test," Robert continued. "Not just for those who inherit it, but for those who benefit from it in any form. Your mother gave you that test 15 years ago, and you've been failing it spectacularly ever since." Patricia started to protest, but Robert held up a hand to silence her. "Patricia, I'm ashamed of the values you've shown tonight. I raised you to understand that privilege comes with responsibility, that success without character is worthless. Instead, you've turned into exactly the kind of person I despise, someone who values position over principle." He turned back to David. "You have a choice now, son. You can use this moment to finally grow into the man your mother hoped you could become, or you can continue down the path of entitlement and selfishness that brought you here. But understand this. The safety net is gone. The training wheels are off. Whatever you choose now, you'll have to live with the real consequences." Margaret stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The culmination of 15 years of hope, sacrifice, and disappointment. Her next words would determine not just her relationship with David, but the entire future of their family. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying both love and steel, "I'm going to be very clear about what happens now. You have exactly one opportunity to make this right." She gestured around the magnificent foyer, taking in the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the expensive art that decorated the walls. "All of this goes away. The subsidies, the hidden support, the business connections that boosted your career. All of it ends today. You'll pay fair market rent for this house or find somewhere you can actually afford. You'll pay market rates for your office space, your club membership, everything." David's face went ashen as the full implications hit him. "Mother, please, you can't." "I can and I will," Margaret interrupted. "But here's your choice. You can accept this new reality with grace and humility, acknowledge the mistakes you've made, and work to rebuild our relationship based on honesty and respect. If you choose that path, I'll help you transition to your new circumstances. I'll be there to support you as you learn to truly earn your success." She paused, letting the weight of the alternative settle over the room. "Or you can continue to believe that you're entitled to advantages you've never earned. Continue to treat me as an embarrassment rather than the mother who's loved you unconditionally for 38 years. If you choose that path, you'll face your new reality alone." David looked around the room desperately, as if searching for some escape from the choice before him. His eyes landed on Patricia, who was watching him with obvious calculation, clearly weighing whether a humbled David was worth maintaining their marriage. They moved to Emma, who watched him with a mixture of love and disappointment that reminded him painfully of his mother's expression. Finally, his gaze settled on James, whose steady presence radiated the kind of integrity David had never bothered to develop. "I need time," David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think about this." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, David. You've had 15 years to think about how to treat your family with respect. You've had 15 years to develop the character that would make you worthy of the advantages you've been given. Time isn't going to change who you've chosen to become." Patricia suddenly stepped forward, her social climber's instincts finally overriding her shock. "This is insane," she declared, her voice carrying the imperious tone she used when trying to intimidate service staff. "You can't just destroy our lives because you're angry about some family disagreement. David, tell her she can't do this to us." But David wasn't looking at his wife. He was staring at Margaret with an expression she hadn't seen since. He was a small child, genuine fear mixed with dawning understanding of consequences he couldn't escape or manipulate his way out of. "What exactly do you want from me?" he asked quietly. Margaret felt her heart break a little at the question. Even now, faced with the complete destruction of his false identity, David couldn't see beyond what was being demanded of him to what was being offered. He couldn't understand that love and respect weren't transactions to be negotiated, but foundations upon which real relationships were built. "I want you to be the man your father would have been proud of," Margaret said simply. "I want you to understand that success without character is meaningless. I want you to treat your family, all of your family, with the love and respect they deserve." She stepped closer to him, and for a moment she was simply a mother looking at her son. "Most of all, David, I want you to understand that what I'm offering you isn't punishment. It's the opportunity to finally become the person you were meant to be, instead of the person that unearned privilege has made you." The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet of a moment poised on the edge of irrevocable change, where every person in the room understood that what happened next would echo through years of family, gatherings, memories, and relationships yet to be built or destroyed. David looked once more around the foyer of the house he'd thought he'd earned, at the life he'd believed he'd built through his own merit, at the family he'd taken for granted. While chasing the approval of strangers, when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd finally understood the full scope of his failures. "I choose," he began, then stopped, the words catching in his throat as he realized that whatever he said next would determine not just his future, but the future of everyone he claimed to love. The morning after the revelation, Margaret sat in her small apartment kitchen, watching Emma spread jam on toast with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain normalcy in an upended world. 3 days had passed since David's choice, or rather his refusal to choose, and the legal machinery Margaret had set in motion was already grinding into action. Patricia Winters had been thorough and efficient, filing the necessary paperwork to end the subsidized arrangements that had propped up David's lifestyle for 15 years. "The movers will be here at 10, Emma said quietly, not looking up from her breakfast. She'd arrived at Margaret's apartment the previous evening with 2 suitcases and a determination that reminded Margaret painfully of James at the same age. "Mom tried to convince me to stay one more time this morning, but I told her my decision was final." Margaret reached across the small table and covered her granddaughter's hand with her own. "Emma, are you absolutely certain about this? Once you move in here, your parents will see it as choosing sides. There might not be a way back to the way things were." Emma looked up, and Margaret saw in her young face a clarity that many adults never achieved. "Grandma, there's no way back anyway. After what I saw the other night, how Dad talked about you, how Mom only cared about the money." I can't pretend we're still the family I thought we were. The weight of Emma's words settled over Margaret like a blanket, warm but heavy with implication. Her granddaughter was only 16, but she'd shown more moral courage in the past few days than David had demonstrated in 15 years. Your father called again this morning, Margaret said gently. He wants to meet, to talk about finding some kind of compromise. Emma's jaw tightened. A compromise? Like what? You keep paying for everything but pretend you're not? Or maybe you take back half the subsidies so he can feel like he's making some sacrifice while still living beyond his means? Margaret was quiet for a moment, struck by how clearly Emma saw through the kind of half measures that David was undoubtedly hoping for. He's still your father, sweetheart, and he's still my son. I don't want you to feel like you have to cut him out of your life because of this. I'm not cutting him out, Emma replied, finally meeting Margaret's eyes. But I'm not going to pretend that what he did was okay either. If he wants a relationship with me, he's going to have to earn it, the same way he should have been earning his relationship with you all along. A soft knock at the apartment door interrupted their conversation. Margaret opened it to find James standing in the hallway with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, a gesture so typically thoughtful that she felt tears threaten. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, stepping inside and immediately enveloping Emma in a hug that she returned fiercely. "Uncle James, did you really know about all of this for years?" Emma asked as they settled around the small kitchen table. James nodded, his expression serious. "I've known about your grandmother's inheritance since I was in college. She told me when I was struggling to pay for my education, wanted me to know that she could help if I needed it." "But you didn't take the help?" "I took some," James admitted. "She paid for my student teaching semester when I couldn't afford to work for free. But she made it clear that her help came with expectations, that I understand the value of what I was receiving, and that I use my education to contribute something meaningful to the world." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. James had always understood what she'd been trying to teach David. The difference was that James had been willing to listen. "What's happening with the house?" Emma asked. James pulled out his tablet and opened several documents. The legal notice was served yesterday morning. David and Patricia have 30 days to either pay fair market rent, which is $8,500 per month, or find alternative housing. The country club membership cancellation goes into effect at the end of this month. The office space reverts to standard. Commercial rates starting next week. Margaret studied the numbers, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. After 15 years of secret subsidies, David was about to discover what his lifestyle actually cost. "How did he react to the Hillcrest notice?" she asked. "Patricia called me screaming about lawsuits and family loyalty," James replied wryly. David seemed almost relieved, actually, like he'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop for years, and it finally had. Emma looked puzzled. "Relieved?" "I think part of your father always knew something wasn't quite right about his success," Margaret explained. "The guilt of that knowledge may have been driving some of his behavior. Now that the truth is out, he doesn't have to live with that subconscious anxiety anymore. But he's also not willing to admit he was wrong," James added. "According to Patricia, he's convinced himself that you've been manipulating him all along, that this whole situation is somehow your fault rather than the consequence of his own choices." Margaret nodded sadly. She'd expected as much. Taking responsibility for his behavior would require a level of character development that David had consistently avoided for years. A second knock at the door announced the arrival of Eleanor Blackwood, carrying what appeared to be legal documents and wearing the expression of someone with important news to share. "Good morning, everyone," Eleanor said, accepting the coffee. James offered her. "I have updates on several fronts. First, the property transfers are proceeding smoothly. Patricia Winters is excellent at her job." She opened her folder and spread several documents on the table. "Second, I've been researching David's actual business performance, stripped of the advantages Margaret provided. It's illuminating. Margaret leaned forward, curious despite herself about what her son had actually accomplished on his own merits. Without the client referrals from your business connections, Eleanor continued, David's client base drops by about 60%. Without the subsidized office space and reduced overhead costs, his profit margins become razor thin. He's actually a competent investment advisor, but not the spectacular success he believed himself to be. So he's not completely incompetent? Emma asked. No, not at all. He has genuine skills and knowledge. But he's been operating with advantages that made him appear far more successful than his actual abilities justified. The shock he's experiencing now isn't just about losing financial support. It's about discovering that his professional identity was largely an illusion. Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that David wasn't completely without merit, but sadness that he'd never bothered to develop his actual potential when success seemed so effortless. There's something else, Eleanor said, her tone shifting to something more hopeful. I've been talking to several organizations about how you might want to use your resources now that you're no longer subsidizing David's lifestyle. There are some wonderful opportunities to make a real difference. Margaret looked around the wide table at the three people who'd become her closest family: James with his steady integrity, Emma with her moral clarity, and Eleanor with her sharp mind and fierce loyalty. For the first time in 15 years, she felt free to be herself without apology or pretense. What did you have in mind? She asked. Eleanor's eyes lit up. The Riverside Community Center that David was so eager to shut down? We could not only reopen it, but expand it. Create job training programs, provide childcare, offer English classes for immigrant families. All the things you wanted to do years ago but couldn't because you were hiding your resources. Emma sat up straighter. Could we really do that? Could we help all those families that Dad displaced when he improved the property value? We could do much more than that, Margaret said, feeling excitement build in her chest for the first time in years. We could create something lasting, something that actually serves the community rather than just generating profit. James smiled at his mother with genuine pride. This is who you've always been, Mom. David just never bothered to notice because he was too busy taking credit for success he didn't earn. As they began sketching out plans for how Margaret might use her resources more openly and meaningfully, she felt a profound shift in her sense of purpose. For 15 years, she'd focused her energy on trying to save one person who didn't want to be saved. Now she could use that same energy to help hundreds of people who desperately needed support. There's one more thing, Emma said suddenly. I want to help, not just with moving in here, but with the community center project. I want to volunteer, to be part of something that actually matters. Margaret looked at her granddaughter with overwhelming love and pride. Here was the next generation, already understanding at 16 what David had failed to grasp at 38. That privilege was meaningless without purpose. That success, without service, was hollow. We'll do it together, Margaret said, feeling tears of joy rather than sorrow for the first time in months. All of us. We'll build something beautiful from the wreckage of all these years. As they spent the morning planning Emma's move and discussing their vision for the community center, Margaret realized that David's rejection of her ultimatum had done something unexpected. It had freed her to become the person she'd always wanted to be. She was no longer hiding her success or apologizing for her values. She was no longer enabling destructive behavior in the name of love. For the first time in 15 years, Margaret Chen was living authentically, surrounded by people who loved her for who she truly was, rather than what she could provide. And while part of her heart would always ache for the son she'd lost, the larger part was finally, genuinely free. The dining room of Margaret's new home glowed with warm light from the crystal chandelier that had once belonged to her mother-in-law. After 6 months of living authentically, Margaret had finally purchased a house worthy of her actual circumstances. Not a mansion designed to impress, but a graceful Victorian with enough space for entertaining and a garden where she could grow the vegetables that reminded her of her childhood. Emma moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, helping arrange the final touches for their first official dinner party. At 17 now, she carried herself with a confidence that had blossomed under Margaret's guidance, the assurance of someone who understood that worth came from character rather than appearance, that success meant contributing to something larger than oneself. "The community center kids made you something special," Emma said, carrying a handmade card decorated with drawings and thank you notes. "They wanted you to know how much the new after-school program means to their families." Margaret accepted the card with hands that trembled slightly. The Riverside Community Center had reopened 3 months ago, transformed from David's abandoned shell into a thriving hub of activity. English classes, job training programs, childcare services, and youth mentorship filled every room. The families, who'd been displaced by David's improvements, were not only welcomed back, but had become integral to the center's success. "Mrs. Chen?" Emma's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Margaret considered the question. This evening's guest list included people from every phase of her journey. Eleanor and Marcus, who'd helped her reclaim her dignity. Robert Morrison Sr., who'd become both trusted advisor and cherished companion. James and his new girlfriend Sarah, a fellow teacher who appreciated his integrity. And most significantly, David. Her eldest son had requested this, meeting 3 weeks ago, after 6 months of living with the real consequences of his choices. Patricia had left him for a pharmaceutical executive with a more reliable income stream, taking half of what little David actually owned. The divorce had been swift and merciless, conducted by lawyers who calculated assets with the same cold precision Patricia had once applied to social climbing. "I'm not nervous," Margaret said finally. "I'm hopeful," which might be more frightening. The doorbell announced the arrival of their first guests. Robert Morrison Sr. entered carrying flowers and wearing the relaxed smile of someone who'd found genuine companionship after years of transactional relationships. Behind him came Eleanor, resplendent in burgundy velvet and carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Margaret, darling," Eleanor said, embracing her friend warmly. "You look absolutely radiant. This house suits you perfectly." James arrived with Sarah, both of them glowing with the happiness of people who'd found their match in values as well as affection. Sarah taught at the same school where James worked, and they'd bonded over their shared commitment to education as social justice. "Mom," James said, pulling Margaret into a hug that lifted her off the ground. "I'm so proud of what you've built here. Dad would have loved this house, this life you've created." Margaret felt tears threaten at the mention of her late husband. David Sr. would indeed have loved this version of their life, honest, purposeful, filled with people who chose to be there, rather than people who felt obligated or entitled to be there. The last guest to arrive was David, and Margaret felt her breath catch as she opened the door. Her son looked different. Thinner, certainly, but also somehow more solid. The anxious energy that had driven him for years had been replaced by something quieter, more grounded. His clothes were still well made, but no longer designer. His car reliable rather than impressive. "Hello, Mother," he said quietly, offering a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite flower, something he'd remembered from childhood. "Hello, David. Come in." As they gathered around the dining table, Margaret marveled at how different this felt from the tense dinner parties she'd endured in her former life. Conversation flowed naturally between topics that mattered: Emma's plans for college, where she intended to study social work; the community center's expansion into job placement services; James and Sarah's engagement, announced just that morning. David participated quietly, asking thoughtful questions and offering observations that showed he'd been listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When Emma mentioned her volunteer work with refugee families, he asked genuine questions about the challenges they faced. When Robert discussed his own charitable foundation, David took notes rather than trying to impress. It wasn't until dessert was served that David finally addressed the reason for his presence. "I need to say something," he began, his voice carrying none of the bluster that had characterized his speech for so many years. "I've spent the last 6 months learning who I actually am when I'm not propped up by advantages I didn't earn. It's been humbling." He looked directly at Margaret, his eyes clear and honest in a way she hadn't seen since he was a child. "I was wrong, Mom. Not just about how I treated you, but about everything. I built my entire adult identity on taking credit for your sacrifices while refusing to acknowledge your role in my life. I convinced myself that my success was entirely my own, while dismissing the person who made it all possible." Margaret felt her heart constrict, remembering all the time she'd hoped to hear these words, all the years she'd waited for this moment of recognition. "I can't undo the damage I've done to our relationship," David continued. "I can't take back the cruel things I said, or the years I wasted on false pride. But I can ask, humbly, with no expectations, if you might be willing to let me try to earn back your respect. Not as your successful son, but as a man who's finally ready to learn what it means to be worthy of the love you've always shown me." The silence that followed was gentle rather than tense, filled with the possibility of genuine healing rather than the desperate hope that had driven Margaret's earlier attempts at reconciliation. "David," she said, "finally, you've just demonstrated more wisdom in 5 minutes than you showed in the previous 15 years. Of course, we can try to rebuild our relationship, but it has to be built on truth this time, about who we are, what we've done, and what we want to become." Emma reached across the table and took her father's hand. "I'd like that too, Dad. I'd like to get to know the person you're becoming." As the evening wound down, Margaret stood in her kitchen washing dishes, a task she performed herself despite being able to afford any level of domestic help. There was something grounding about the simple ritual, something that connected her to the practical woman she'd always been underneath the wealth she'd inherited. Robert joined her at the sink, drying dishes with the comfortable efficiency of someone who'd learned not to equate service with servitude. "That went well," he said quietly. "Better than I'd dared hope," Margaret agreed. "Though I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. David still has a lot of growing to do." "Don't we all?" Robert smiled. But tonight he showed genuine humility. That's the foundation everything else can be built on. Margaret nodded, thinking about foundations, how her marriage to David Sr. had been built on shared values and mutual respect, how her relationship with James had been built on honesty and unconditional love, how her bond with Emma was growing stronger because it was based on who they actually were rather than who they pretended to be. As her guests prepared to leave, Margaret stood in her own front hall, in her own house, filled with her own choices, and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been thrown out into a storm by a son who saw her as an embarrassment. Tonight, that same son had asked for the chance to earn her respect. The difference wasn't just in David's attitude, though that was significant. The difference was in Margaret herself. She was no longer the hidden martyr, sacrificing her dignity to enable someone else's dysfunction. She was no longer the secret benefactor, hoping that anonymous generosity would somehow teach character to someone who refused to learn. She was simply Margaret Chen, a woman who'd learned to use her resources wisely, to love without enabling, and to live authentically, regardless of how others chose to receive that authenticity. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Margaret reflected on the profound truth she'd discovered through her painful journey. Real love sometimes required the courage to let people fail, and authentic relationships could only be built on the foundation of mutual respect and honest acknowledgement of what each person brought to the connection. Tomorrow, she would continue building the life she'd finally found the courage to claim. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully in her own home, surrounded by the love of people who valued her for exactly who she was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.